Welcome to Real Hot Nerd Shit, a pop culture podcast where real hot nerds talk about real nerd shit. I'm your host, Ryan.
I'm your co-host, Shauna.
And today, in this installment of My Favorite Nerd Shit, we will be talking about a mutual love between Shauna and I, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And in order to do that properly, we have invited another nerdy friend to sit with us. Welcome, Logan.
Hi, y'all.
Hi, Logan. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. So, we'll do maybe now's the good time because I think one thing that's important to say is this is the third time that we have tried to record this. So per Shauna's absolutely just genius pun brain, we've decided that the episode is going to be called Once More with Feeling. And we're going to do it once more with feeling. And this is that once more. So Shauna and I got connected with Logan last year for Flaming River Con, which is the first time that all three of us were together. But I've known Logan for a few years through mutual friends. Do you want to talk a little bit about Flaming River Con as a plug before we jump in?
Yeah, so Flaming River Con was founded in 2017 as a 501c3 nonprofit. We focus on uplifting queer voices in the geek community here in Northeast Ohio. And every year, aside from the COVID years, we have hosted Flaming River Con, which is a one-day event. We move locations each year just to do things sometimes on the west side, sometimes on the east side. But we have a vendor hall. We focus on, or we feature, I should say, queer voices in the geek community. We have had folks like Tony Isabella, who's the creator of Black Lightning there, Cena Grace, who writes for DC. Yes, an amazing human. Was our actual...
Really and truly.
Yes, like our first featured speaker at Flaming River Con. And this year, the event is fastly approaching. We are less than 4 weeks out. It will be September 21st at the Cleveland Heights Community Center. To get more information, you can check out flamingriver.com or follow us on Instagram or Facebook just at Flaming River Con.
There's literally so much cool stuff. Some of it is sitting around me. I bought this pouch last year at Flaming River Con that keeps all of my nerdy pins and buttons in it.
As it should. I love that.
Specifically, the backs to buttons or to pins so you don't lose them. I'm sure there's other stuff around me too. I think, and Shauna, you encouraged me to buy this.
Absolutely. Right, and they're so targeted towards us in a really great way. Like they know their target audience, and I'm actually oh wait, I don't have it here. Wait, I have my Zagreus pillow from Hades.
Yes.
It's actually my back support, so I'm going to steal it right now because it feels decent. But
hell yeah, 30s.
So yeah, exactly. But you know what? You can still be a real hot nerd in your 30s and or 40s.
Hell yeah, you can. Logan, what are you a hot nerd about? What gets your hot nerd? There's no follow-up words that I can say there that aren't going to be gross. So I'm just going to go back to the first form of the question. What makes you a hot nerd?
Once more with feeling.
Comic books, for the longest time, since I basically could read, has been the thing that I, for whatever reason, I love to know everything about and just devour and consume any kind of comic. Doesn't matter if it's good or bad, to the point where I feel very not seen down on, but I know a lot about comics. Like, you could ask me about a specific thing, like what issue did this happen in, or who drew this, and it's like that's my thing. And it's like people like comic books, but like I know that it's really nerdy the way that I consume them. And then of course, obviously, the reason we're all here is Buffy. It's the same thing. We've all talked about this at length, like being able to know episode titles and seasons and who did this and why this. So I feel like there's a small percentage of people that go as nerdy as I do about things, but some of that probably is just my OCD and other things coming out.
Yeah. The two things I wanted to comment on. One, Are you a general comics? Do you lean heavily more into one DC Marvel, Dark Horse, etc.?
Historically, it's been Marvel, especially growing up, because that's predominantly like what my older cousins read and my mom read, and that's who I got comics from. But the older I've gotten, I've definitely leaned more into like indie comics. I've definitely grown into loving DC in the last few years. I've always liked DC, but it was always kind of like I never was a huge fan of. Like I like the aesthetic of Batman, but I kind of thought his shtick was like I was like, well, I like Spider-Man, and he doesn't have parents, and Batman doesn't have parents, and he just a little
right.
Well, Bruce Wayne can be a little whiny. Even as a kid, I was like, this guy's not having a good time.
Right.
Well, a billionaire is, generally speaking, a lot harder to be relatable. Like, at the end of the day, like, Marvel speaks to us, I think, in a way as, queer people and this, like, sense of found family, where I feel like even from an early age, those themes kind of have always spoken to at least me, and I think that's something like you've said in your experience, Ryan, as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why, like, for DC, when it comes to the Bat family, I'm a big Nightwing fan. And I think that speaks to like my queerness and also the idea of found family, and that makes sense to me. But yeah, I definitely lean more towards Marvel and independent comics predominantly.
Yeah.
But
do you have any recommendations for nerds that are looking for just a way to get into indie comics? Like Boom Studios I think I actually own the most Boom Studios. No, between
Boom Studios is fantastic.
Yeah, Boom Studios and Dark Horse, because they're both the ones that produce or release the Buffy comic books.
Mm-hmm.
So they rebooted the Buffy verse in comics over at Boom Studios, and it's been really, really great. But like, I get overwhelmed by collecting comics, and so for me, focusing just on collecting Buffy comics, I was like, I am a true collector now of comics. Like, this is the one thing that I will focus on.
I think that's
that's why trades have always spoken to me.
Yeah.
Because I find it so much easier to collect, because I feel like then having to make sure, like, the ritual of collecting every week is something that I struggled with when I was younger, let alone now as, a very overscheduled adult. And so trying to find that, like, I think that's definitely where they've always spoken to me, like.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And the price too, honestly, like I understand like everything's gone up, but comics have gotten more expensive, so that's an accessibility issue, and just tracking them down, like you said, week to week, being an adult. And I think it is nice, like trades, honestly, like I used to be very against, I'm such a like tactile person, like
same.
I was very like against like having a Kindle or reading online, but like there are apps that you can read comics, that there's Marvel Unlimited, there's Comixology, all these things that like make it more accessible to get into. And I think that is important. And like another thing is space, in the last few years, I finally like really honed in like what it is, one, that I want to spend money on to have the physical copy, but also just having the space. And moving comics is, it's not fun. It's just like moving books isn't fun.
Right.
So I think that's definitely a thing. But I think trades are a good way. And then just picking out an issue. I know we say don't judge a book by its cover, but sometimes you walk into a comic shop and you don't know where to start. I say go to the indie section and see. And then there are some writers who are always knocking things out of the park too, like Ram V, Jeff Lemire. I think Cena Grace, not to name drop again, but Cena has been doing incredible work. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do with their Jonathan Kent book that's coming out soon.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Really quickly, before we continue to use words that people don't understand, what's a trade? Not in this instance. What is, we have said the word trade. Shauna, do you want to talk about what a trade is? And again, in this instance, not the other thing, homosexuals that are listening. Not the other version of trade. Great at those too.
A comic book trade paperback is a collection of comic books, usually, let's say, episodes 1 through 10, where a whole story will all be in one form. So instead of the every issue that you want to save, and then like kind of what Logan was alluding to, the bag and board, where you put it in, a little plastic baggie so it's like maintains its form, and then box it, which takes up a lot of room. It's just a little thing that can go on your shelves, and so it's easier to display, easier to read, and I think it's a great jumping in point because then you can start and be like, oh, I want to read, let me read this arc, and I want to understand it, and it's a great way to really read stories, because I feel like there's so much, and it can be really difficult to want to be a collector and like knowing where to jump in and where not, and so having a like, oh, I'm going to start here, or this is like the new writers where they jump on, and being able to do it that way, I think is a lot easier.
Yeah, it's
still
also
buy from
great
your local
for
shop.
What'd you say?
Oh, but still make sure you buy it from your local comic book shop.
Yes, yeah, that's I will
local.
buy my
comic books supporting local is very important.
Yes. Agreed. And admit, no one's perfect. I absolutely order stuff online because it's easier.
Nobody's
sometimes,
perfect, however.
Nobody's yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I couldn't even say the up version, right?
Yeah, if you have the means, do so. But sometimes it is hard depending on where you are. Like I was really lucky.
You can't gatekeep it.
Yeah, no, not at all. Some people, I mean, comic shops are closing, unfortunately, even more rapidly than they have, I feel like, in years, despite the interest being high because of a lot of online sales and things like that.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say, maybe before we move on from comic talk, is that like one of my first endeavors into like really getting into reading comic books, because I didn't necessarily read comic books growing up. It was a thing that I would like dabble in, and like when I would go to the library as a kid, that was kind of always my like, I don't really know what I want to read, so I'll go look at some comics. But when I was in, I think honestly like mid-20s, a classmate of mine when I was in grad school, Kevin, lent me X-Men, the Uncanny X-Men Omnibus, and we had been traveling to California or something. It's like thick as fuck. It's like 165 issues or something. It's absolutely wild. And I consumed that as quickly as possible while we were traveling, and I was like, okay, this is how you can jump into stuff, like you were saying, Shauna. Like,
absolutely.
I have just the Civil War story. Like, you can just get stories too. They will break trades into stories. They will break trades when there's like a good, like not jumping in point, but like when one story ends and the other begins. That's usually like, they tend to wrap them up or keep them lumped together for storytelling purposes.
Well, and like the visual encyclopedia for the X-Men is something I can still picture, with like Wolverine on the cover, and like the white book that like you would get from like Borders, like as a kid, and was where I know, like that was that was how I read about it, like so many ways. It was like, yeah, definitely the different ways in which generations past and present are getting their comic book information, and I'm like so excited to see like where that keeps going. But all right, back to Buffy.
Back to Buffy, which kind of works. So we're talking about our nerdy stuff. How long we've been doing it for. Let's talk origin stories. So Logan, as our guest, do you want to tell us how you got into Buffy? What's your Buffy origin story?
Yeah, I feel like mine might be a little different than a lot of people. So mine is actually a product of, like I mentioned earlier, my mom was like the earliest and biggest influence on why I like nerd shit. My mom is a massive nerd, and growing up, she was really into like Star Trek, Star Wars, comics. She's the first person that put a comic book in my hand, and probably was too young to start watching Buffy right off the bat. But thanks to the good old WB and us having bunny ears TV, we didn't have cable, but we could still watch it. And so my mom was like, we're going to watch this show together. She got off work late, but every Tuesday at 8 p.m., we would put the WB on and watch Buffy together. And I've been watching pretty much, I asked her actually leading up to this, and I just remember this. I was like, did we start on the first episode? She was like, I can't remember if we watched the very first one, but as that aired, but it was season 1 for sure. And our local WB would air the previous week's episode before the new one. Mm-hmm. And I didn't remember that. And she was like, so I think it was in the first like 2 to 3, she thinks, that we started watching it. So that's how I found Buffy. I was very, very young. So a lot of the early jokes definitely went over my head.
Right. It's just such a cool thing. I don't know if you listen to the podcast Slayer Fest 98, Logan, mm-hmm. But yeah, he's also similarly got put onto it by his mom, and I just think that's so cool. I didn't really get that kind of stuff. Like my parents and I didn't really bond over anything like that. But I know, Shauna, you're definitely trying to do that with your kiddo. But do you want to maybe talk about your Buffy origin story?
Yeah. So for me, I think I was always kind of around it. Like I remember being at a friend's house, like from like because I'd hang out with like my comic book shop friends, and like they put on the first episode of Buffy I technically ever saw was the finale because it was just on in the background,
right?
And I was like, oh, okay, and I didn't think anything of it. But then when I was coming to terms with coming out as a trans woman and was like, Buffy was one of those first shows that I watched during that period, and I was like, oh. And I really saw myself in Buffy Summers. Like, the way that she always handled adversity with wit and while being strong but still showing vulnerability. And like, someone who she found like a lot of, her friend circle and like family looking to, even as she's feeling everything and all the pressure. Like, those were all things that really spoke to me about the character. And the show ended up being a really like great, like, it's been now one of my loves for the past decade plus ever since.
Yeah. I similarly, I didn't really jump in at the beginning. I do have one odd memory of like, I think maybe season 2, the Halloween episode. I think I remember seeing that in real time on TV when it aired. And then I also remember the marketing campaign leading up to Buffy being revived on UPN. And I remember like the Xander cut and there was like a Willow cut. And I've since like kind of watched them again on YouTube, and I'm like, oh shit, I do remember this. Like, I surprised, but mine was my Buffy origin story was deeply connected to the fact that I've just always liked the girls and stuff. So my, Pink Ranger, Storm, Jean Grey, Rogue, Batgirl, they're my girls. Like they instilled this sense of like, it equated femininity with strength in ways that I had already sort of seen from the women in my family, but at the same hand, seeing it, portrayed in media, and then also seeing it in myself that, I was a little femme. And I don't think I ever had that switch moment to be like, oh, girls can be heroes. I just think it was always there. Like, girls will beat your ass. And so by the time I got to high school, I was a little bit more vocal about it. Everyone knew, I mean, not everyone knew, but whatever. In conversation, enough people knew me to know that was my zhuzh. Like, I picked the girl characters and stuff when we're playing video games. And this guy, Jamie Scott, shout out to Jamie. We were in sophomore English class together. And I remember he like turned around and said something, because I think we were in season for the musical, which was The Music Man that year. And I just remember him saying, like, you do know that there's a Buffy musical, right? And I was like, there's a what? And the open seas of the internet, as it were, I took a lot of advantage of the open seas of the internet. And so I procured several random episodes, starting with Buffy, starting with Once More with Feeling. And that was I think the very first episode I ever watched all the way through. Which sets a pretty high fucking bar, because the characters are settled in that episode. Like, you also get exposition in a very different way. But I think what made me be like, yo, what the fuck is this? Is when she kisses Spike at the end, because I only knew Spike as a villain. And I was like, well, what could have gotten us here that she's making out with Spike? And I was just invested, and I started going back, and I started buying seasons on DVDs, and I still have all 7, because when, the apocalypse comes, beat me. I will still have access to my favorite television show.
So I think something that
no, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to, thinking about a point you made about how, like, growing up, you always found yourself drawn to, like, these, like, great, strong women characters. And I think that really, I find that very, like, juxtaposed to, like, my experience, where I felt often very reluctant to identify early with those kinds of characters for fear that, because, like, that, like, knowing something's up but not sure what it is, kind of feeling like, will they know if I pick that I really like, will they then use it against me? Will they and like, because that's so how, like, something that I know I definitely felt very strongly, not just like in my 20s especially, but like before that, growing up, like, I could usually like, but at the same time also like being drawn to like a lot of shows like, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Sister, like those like staple kinds of shows that were like some of my absolute favorites as a kid.
Same.
Like where like they were like appointment television in many ways, but like it felt different in those kinds of ways versus like the superhero where like, well, why wouldn't you just pick the boy one?
Right.
Like,
there's so many boys.
like,
why wouldn't you just be the boy?
Right, like, but I often then found myself drawn to characters that wore masks. And I often find myself characters that found themselves, like, hidden in that kind of way.
Shit, Shauna, that's deep.
Right? Like...
That's fucking deep.
And I never knew why until I was like, oh, I bet that element of, like...
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole, I'm sure, I know there is, like, sociological study on queerness and superheroes and like that specifically, like who likes or who is drawn to. Like, even you saying that, thinking back, I'm like, yeah, I always liked, like, obviously Wolverine, hello, but preferred him to be drawn with the suit on. Like, when they started really like leaning into Logan sans mask, I was like, this doesn't look as cool as I wanted to. And then you saying that, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Because now I'm like, oh yeah, that's fine. Show his face. But
yeah,
like Cyclops, Daredevil, like all of those kinds of like, yep. Heck, even Gambit, like the kind of like,
oh, this could be a 100%. Wig underneath. That's really what it is. It's just to hide the bad hairline, just to show that it's a wig.
That's true.
Logan, was when your mom like sort of brought Buffy to you, did you get that sort of like social justice-y part of it too? Like, just so you know, girls can be heroes, like, or was it just like, here's some shit that I think you'll like, or that you're going to watch with me because I want to watch it and you're here. Did you get the whole package, or was it just, the show?
I did, obviously back then, in the 90s, my mom didn't really have the language, but she was very much the same. She gravitated obviously towards like very strong female characters. Like, to this day, my mom's email is a Jean Grey reference in every email that I think she's ever had. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Any non-professional email that she's ever had in her life has always been a reference to Jean Grey. That is her main.
Your mom's really cool. Your mom's really cool.
She's a delight. But yeah, like, she was always like, especially like me, or my mom is white, my dad is Filipino, but she always wanted me to know, like, no matter what anyone says, you can also be strong. Like, my mom is just this badass woman. She was diagnosed with MS when I was 6, and she's still around and mobile, and like, but it was the same thing. Like, she liked seeing strong female characters on screen or reading, or like in a book or on the page. So for her, she always ingrained that into me. It's like, it doesn't matter what everyone else says about you. It's about who you are as a person and what you do with that. And like, I've kind of just always carried that with me. And I think for her, seeing Buffy was just like the opposite also of how she grew up. Like, Buffy's in Southern California and like all this stuff. My mom's like, I live in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, my whole life. But like, that thread was there. And I think that to this day, she talks about how influential on her as an adult Buffy is and was. So.
Yeah. And following that thread of the baked in feminism of it, I think we need to take one quick detour to talk about the jackass behind it all. So for folks that are unaware, Buffy was originally a movie created by Joss Whedon. The movie is high camp, Unfortunately, Christy Sutherland, the girl that plays the very first Buffy, ended up being a very out loud Trump supporter, and unfortunately told us all that on Twitter. So now it's even easier to say there is only one Buffy Summers. We don't recognize the other one. Because she's whack, and so is the guy that made her. However, Joss Whedon always positioned himself as this sort of like feminist, he's the one that's writing these characters this way and creating these opportunities for women. His whole pitch for Buffy was like, what if in the horror movie, the blonde girl that's getting chased ends up saving the day? And it is a really cool concept. And it was such a traditional flip on what we were used to. And I think the fact that Sarah Michelle Gellar specifically was in horror movies and was killed in those horror movies, the blonde girl can win. The blonde girl can be the final girl, if you will. And unfortunately, we have learned a lot over the past probably like 10, 15 years about how Joss Whedon behaved and how he misused his power and abused his power and did real harm to people. We got a little bit of a firsthand account from Charisma Carpenter, who plays Cordelia Chase in the first 3 seasons of Buffy, and then in the 4 seasons of Angel. And basically we learned that his violence and control was so deep that when Charisma Carpenter found out she was pregnant, he asked her if she was going to keep it, and she said yes. And so he wrote the pregnancy in the grossest, weirdest way possible that stripped all agency from the character and then killed her. And that was one of the things that everyone knew was like, if you piss Joss off, he will write you out, he'll kill you off. So no one ever said anything. Kind of like peak abuse of power, hostile workplace, behavior. And so a lot of us that are Buffy fans have really, initially struggled. I don't feel weird about it at all now, but so Shauna, Logan, how do you feel about, still consuming Buffy content when we know so much about the person that created it? And I'll save mine. I know what both your answers are, but for our listeners, how do we critically consume things like that?
Well, I think the most important thing is that you attempt to critically consume it, because to not think about it and to ignore it is the only wrong way to go about it, in my opinion. And I think that for me personally, what I always try and think about is, especially for Buffy, that it is so much more than Joss Whedon, that the actors, the episode writers, the showrunners, there's a real, and the effect that the show has had on people, I think is such a overall positive that it lives so much past Joss Whedon. And I think especially considering that he really did purport himself to be this like feminist hero icon. Like, this is what like a man supporting women should be. Like, he was put on that pedestal for so long, under it all, undercutting the exact ways in which he was said to be elevating. And I think I think that always goes to show to sometimes be careful of people who are too quick to say how much they're how much they're doing for this group or that group, and especially as an out member. I think it just seems like it can be such a red flag of like, but I think that's where at least I do enjoy the works and writings of Joss Whedon. I think he's a very talented man, and for better or for worse. And I think that, but unfortunately, like, there's nothing I can do about that other than be aware and make sure supporting all the other people who are involved in Buffy.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. Like, it's one of those things where like you said, I absolutely adore his work. There are parts of it obviously that are problematic, and now knowing who he is, that makes sense. So like looking back on it and rewatching, you can see that. And I think it's one of those things where once you have the knowledge about a creator and their actions or their views, and then you see it under that guy, like through that lens, And then, you know, that moving forward, when they produce other work or are working on things like, you know, for me, I wouldn't give him any more of any money and directly for something. Like if he came out and was like, I'm directing this thing specifically, you know, but like buying the comics, like I buy Buffy comics. He's still connected to that. I buy secondhand. I still have some of his Astonishing X-Men comics because like that was a great run, you know,
great run. Oh my God.
A fantastic run. And, you know, I'm obviously a huge Marvel fan and he worked on the Avengers movies, but it's one of those things where like you can pick up on it. Like, you know, there are things that are tried and true that you see in his works now that going back to like, he was so loud about being a feminist. And it's like, no, you really weren't. And like the self-insert, which I'm sure we'll talk about in his works. And I think it's one of those things just
You mean the worst part of Buffy? Xander?
Yeah. You mean, the Bruce and Natasha quote unquote romance in the Avengers movies where, you know, it mimics this idea.
The signs were so there. Like in hindsight,
but you know, at the time you have those rose-colored glasses on because you love this thing so much and you don't know anything about him. So like, why would you read it that way on initial watch? And then when it all came out, it's like, oh yeah, okay, got it. But I can't fault people who aren't as into it when they find Buffy, like if they don't have that knowledge or not of him, you know, because it's already kind of not forgotten, but like it doesn't get talked about in larger circles, you know, which is nice.
Right. Like it's very niche. Like this director who does have a big profile, but ultimately at the end of the day, like certain, you know, like Twitter isn't everywhere. Like remembering that it's this small circle sometimes is really easy when you're in like those kinds of nerdy spaces to know that that's not every space. And that's not how everybody consumes things.
Exactly.
And I do think that there's like, there's levels to it, right? Like, so kind of like you all were saying, Buffy has gotten so much bigger than just that one person. So, you know, even to your point, Logan, you know, buying secondhand or trying to figure out ways to have as little of my money go to him as possible.
Yeah.
You know, that's just one of the ways that we do it. It's one of the ways that we try to critically consume something. I know I don't want my money going to him, but you know, for the comics, for example, I don't know how pay scales work. I don't, you know, I'm not I don't know that much around intellectual property, but you know, I want to pay those writers. I want to pay those artists. Absolutely. I want to pay those, like, so to withhold my money from, you know, huge groups of people that are working on a project for one person. But like you said, you know, if he's directing something, if he is putting something out that is like, it's his project and it's a new thing, I'm super not interested. Even, you know, thinking about like musicians, the notorious sex predator who preyed on Black girls that's in jail, I go out of my way to find ways to turn it off in public. Like, I don't need to hear, that's, you know, sort of a direct connection. That's his voice, his music, his song.
Yes.
And I don't want that around me. So I will say things like, isn't it gross to think this song is probably about a child? And then it usually like really bums everyone out. Yeah. And I will argue with people. I mean, I'll argue with people over most things, but like that is like a different level of sort of critical consumption, in the sense that I will not consume it in any way, shape, or form by choice. And so things like Buffy, where, you know, half the time I think some of the stuff with Buffy is I like to hear other people talk about it too. So like I listen to Buffy podcasts, and then that inspires me to go listen or like, you know, rewatch an episode. And so, you know, the content is so vast. Like I'm reading Tales of a Slayer right now. Like the content is so vast. You can stay in that world and still recognize like the place that this came from is gross and toxic. And like you said, it did show up in a lot of ways. And also I feel like there's enough distance between the product that I'm holding and the original creator that it makes it a little bit easier to, I guess, honestly live with myself. Cause we definitely, we all make unethical choices. It's like, it's very hard to live ethically under capitalism.
Absolutely.
And so there is always a little buzz in the back of my head, like, you shouldn't, but if I can put things in place, that buzz gets a little bit quieter so that I can still find fucking joy in this world.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's the Good Place problem, I don't know if you both have watched that show, but it's like, if you trace it back far enough, everything is unethical. So I think it's just being conscious of that and trying to do it as often and frequently as possible, but it is impossible to do it 100% of the time. Yeah, and there's
every situation is different too.
Yeah.
Right. So let's, in that same vein, we have, the characters before, as we got older, you start focusing more on like the writing and the scene direction. And like, for example, thinking about the fashion of Buffy, like I can recreate Buffy outfits in my mind. My friend Ryan, shout out Ryan, we were playing this game on my front porch one day where he would literally just Google a random episode of Buffy, show me a picture and ask like, what's this from? And I could tell you based on her outfit, what scene it is, what's happening in the scene, what episode it is, what season it is.
Yeah.
So, the universe of Buffy is so broad, but what brings it all to reality, what makes us actually connect at first is the characters. So let's talk faves, least faves, who was wasted, like what characters did we not get enough of? Shauna, who are your top characters?
I think my top character that I want to highlight she gets to be part of the main cast moving forward after like she's originally introduced as like a one-off, but I love Anya. Yes. Anya is one of my absolute favorites.
Yes.
She's like one of my favorite of the archetype of characters who don't people well. Like is just very like I love a great doesn't people well person. Like she's so good at that. And so I definitely like she's so funny but has heart. Ultimately has her character grows and changes. And I think the fact that Xander left her, she was so much better off for it. Like what a great man, she even was willing to fucking fall for Xander. Like, speaking of like least favorite,
it might be the most human thing though. Is like a really great woman falling for a very terrible man,
right? Like, relatable.
And obviously, one of the things that Logan alluded to earlier is Xander is Joss's proxy. Xander is him. Xander is what Joss wishes he could be. In a lot of ways. So he's disgusting, he's foul, he does not grow as a character throughout the entire series. Like he is the same person, just older and with one less eye by the end of the series. But he pulls Cordelia Chase, the baddest bitch in Sunnydale.
Yeah.
He pulls Anya, a fucking vengeance demon, and gets her to become a human being because she loves him so much. Like that would never happen with I mean he did, he was married and his ex-wife has come out and said how terrible he is, but blah blah blah. Anyways, Xander's not anyone's favorite. Logan, who's in your top faves?
Obviously Oz. I feel like no one can see me right now, but it checks out the line tracks on that 100%. One. And I also feel like his character was a little bit wasted, but we get a lot of great moments with him. I think Giles for me is definitely up there. And Faith. Those are probably, I think I can concretely say my top three.
My girl.
Anya is very close, but there's Eliza Dushku. I love everything about her. I love everything about Faith. Even when she shows up in Angel, I was so excited. It was great. She's wonderful.
Yeah.
And
I have a really hard time because I think we're all kind of just saying like, Buffy's up there. Depending on how she's being written and what the situation is, she might not always be my favorite. But as a character, she's pretty solidly, up there. She's number 0. Like she's not
100%.
Yeah, she's like
that sounds like for me. Yeah, I can't.
But honestly, I feel very similar about Willow too, for that matter. I feel like she's Willow's also 0.5. Very like. Right, like, and then because like I was thinking like, oh, who are my favorite? I'm like, well, like I love Spike. I think Spike is one of my favorite characters, and and I love his interactions with Drusilla and with Angel. Like, we were getting our technical maladies unmaladied at the beginning of this, we were talking about how much season 2 is a real fun season. But honestly, for me, the best parts of season 2 are when Angelus, Drew, and Spike are all together and being this weird polyamorous, very gay for each other. Like, always, like, I was like, oh, they have fun on in their side adventures, especially with those are like some of the best parts for me.
Yeah, I have a really hard time because I think Faith is my favorite Slayer, but there's Kendra, and the pro-Black woman part of me is like, Kendra has to be my favorite Slayer. I see my video glitching out. That's really strange.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you saw that. Like, I was like, okay.
Maybe it's because I started talking about Kendra.
Adam's hacked into the system. No,
Malcolm.
How dare
you
Malcolm
do not like season 2.
I was gonna say it's Malcolm.
Oh God.
Yeah. But I think Faith is my favorite Slayer. Cordelia is another one of my favorite characters. The growth of her is just next level. I think the third one would probably be Giles. He's just so dreamy and handsome, and also like such a great father figure, and he's got depth, and like the moments that he really steps into his deep affection for Buffy. So like, by season 3, Helpless, when he has to take her powers away, or even Prophecy Girl, when he realizes that Buffy is going to die, and he's like, oh no, then I just have to kill the Master. Like, he is such a great father figure. I think we all need a Giles in our life. All right, y'all, we hit some technical difficulties, so we're going to end this recording here, and we'll pick up in part 2. See you there.